When evening came, he was at table with his disciples. And in some texts it says he was reclining at table with his disciples. People sat on little couches. The table was much lower than the table we're sitting at. Not unlike in the Orient, people will eat on very low tables. And there'd be small couches that would be close to the floor, and they would, in a sense, half sit and half lean on these couches as they ate. And that's the way they would eat a solemn meal, or if they had a personage they were inviting into their home for a celebration, they would have that kind of style for them, the meal. This is not a Middle Eastern style. This is a Roman style that the Jews took over from Rome. Today, you go among the Bedouins, the people of the desert in Palestine, and you go into their tents, and it's time to eat, and what do? They roll out the Oriental rugs. And they bring in the pillows. So you sit on the Oriental rug and you lean on a pillow, and it's a very relaxing kind of atmosphere or spirit. And it's the way of entertaining. It's the way of providing for one's guests. So in some instances we're told that they reclined at table. Then the question of Judas arises, and the betrayer, and Jesus says, "It is the one who will dip his hand into the bowl with me." Now, the practice of sharing food from a common bowl was part of the Passover ritual. So it would be a way of identifying who that person is by saying, both of us will reach into the bowl at the same time. So Judas, in a sense, violates not only the bond between those who eat together, but he violates the bond of those who celebrate Passover as a household. Passover is a celebration of a household. Remember, from the very beginning, every household was to obtain a lamb. And if the household was too small for a whole household, then they were to go to the next door neighbor and form a larger household. So it was a household celebration. And along with that would have been the sense of there being a camaraderie between the people, a unity that existed between the people, a closeness, and that one would not invite just anybody to the Passover table. So Judas, not only does he violate the protocol of being respectful of the others at the table, but he violates the bond that is present at Passover. Then we're told that Jesus takes the bread, and a little bit later that he takes the cup. He takes the bread, and we're told he blesses it. Now, that action would be very familiar at the average Jewish Sabbath or at holiday meals. His blessing is not a consecration. It is a thanksgiving. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. That's what the blessing would be. And incidentally, that's the way we start our Eucharistic prayer. The priest lifts the host and he says, "Blessed are you, Lord our God. We offer you this bread, food from the earth, the work of the hands of men and women, that it may bring you glory." So it's that same blessing that is done over the bread and the blessing that is done over the wine. in the blessing over the wine, God is referred to as the creator of the fruit of the vine. Then after the blessing, we're told that he gives the bread to them, and he said, "Take it and eat." Now, sharing in Jesus' bread means sharing in his death, because he has said, "This is my body, take it and eat." So the invitation is the invitation to enter with him into the moment of his dying for the salvation of the world. Jesus gives a new meaning to that action of the Jewish ritual, that sharing the loaf of bread and the sharing of the cup of wine is sharing into the mystery of the death of the Lord. Food was shared. Food was, you didn't have a basket of rolls and, pass the rolls around and everyone take their roll. What you did is you had a loaf of bread and you broke it apart and people all took a piece of it. I think it was around 1971 or 1972. Father Dennis Deese and I went for a week's vacation after Easter Sunday. We flew out to San Francisco, and we were going to drive from San Francisco down to San Diego. And we got into San Francisco late on Easter Sunday night, and we hadn't had anything to eat. And so we wanted to go out to eat, and we had a hotel room downtown, and we began walking around the downtown area looking for an open restaurant. We couldn't find anything. Everything was closed down. After all, it was Easter night. Ultimately, we found a restaurant that was open. At least we looked in the window, and there were a lot of people sitting there, and they were eating. So we presumed it was an open restaurant. We walked in, and it wasn't an open restaurant. This was an Armenian restaurant, and the Armenian family that owned the place was so large that they couldn't gather at anybody's house, so they went down to the restaurant for their Easter meal. Well, they were very hospitable. They invited Dennis and myself into the meal. They gave us a place, and they invited us to sit down. Now, in the middle of the table was a huge round piece of bread. And what they did was they would tear the bread as they were eating and offer the bread to each other, and they would use the bread to sop up the gravy and, all of that kind of thing. And I said to the owner of the restaurant, I said, "This is really a very large piece of bread. I mean, and we're not going to eat it all." Oh, he said, "You're not supposed to eat it all. Not supposed to eat it all." He said, "The reason I have this large piece of bread is I need to teach my children something. And I need to teach my children that when you share, there's more than enough for everyone." So he said, "We have a big piece of bread." Well, in Jesus' time, the practice was sharing food, sharing out of common bowls and a common use of the loaf of bread. Then we're told in the gospel that after the handing around of the bread, that, he hands around the bread and then he says, "Eat, take and eat." Now, that sentence, that phrase, "take and eat," especially the eat part, is interpreted as a tendency on the early church to conform the account of the gospel to the liturgical practice of the church. So that when people come to the Eucharist, what they're told to do is to take and eat. So when they write the story of the Last Supper, what Jesus does is he says to his disciples, "Take and eat." The eating part is not part of the words used at the Passover. But it is the part that is included in the gospel story, and as I say, the presumption is that in order to tie the story into the liturgy, they will use some of the same words and gestures that are found in liturgy that would not have been found in the Passover. Then we're told that, again, he took the cup. And there's no interval of time between Jesus' action with the bread and the action of the cup. He took the bread, blessed it, broke it, gave it to them, take and eat. He took the cup, again, prayed the blessing, gave it to them, said, take and drink. Now that's probably not the way it happened. It is the way the liturgy happens, though. It was probably close to the end of the meal that the cup of blessing was prayed. There are 4 cups that have got prayers connected to them in the Passover. And the 4th cup is the cup of the Messiah. You see, the Jews believed that the Messiah would arrive during the Passover meal. That's why even to today, in an Orthodox Jewish household, you leave the front door open. You prop the front door open because if the Messiah comes, that's a sign he's welcome in. So you leave the door open, and there is a cup. And it's called the cup of Elijah, because Elijah the prophet is supposed to come and announce the coming of the Messiah. But it is the messianic cup. It's the cup that is focused on the fulfillment of the promise God had made to fully redeem the people of Israel. So it was probably during that cup and the prayers associated with it, which would be appropriate for the event that was taking place, that the gift of take this cup and drink from it. But that's not the way the story is told. Largely because the liturgy has the prayer over the bread and the prayer over the cup together. So as they write the story of the passion and death of Jesus, when they come to the Last Supper, they do what the liturgy does. They put the story together. Then we're told, this is the covenant in my blood. The blood of the covenant refers to the book of Exodus, where Moses seals God's covenant with Israel by sprinkling the people with an animal's blood. Remember, they slay the lamb, and the blood is to be sprinkled on the people, and then it is to mark a doorpost, so that when the angel comes through Egypt, the angel passes by. That's pass over. The angel passes over these homes that are marked. And then we're told that this blood, is to be poured out, and it is to be poured out for, and here we've had all kinds of controversy, poured out for the many. Now, the many means everyone. So you've got the few, the hand-picked, and then you've got the many, the whole group. There isn't a third group that is all. Even in popular speech, the reference to the many really refers to what is complete, what is full, what is. So when you go to a birthday party and you celebrate the person's birthday, you can congratulate them. You say ad multos annos, for May you have this joy for many years. But that you don't mean for many years, like 27 years, and then may the whole thing fall apart. No, you mean for all time, for all years. So the blood is poured out for the many, for everyone. And this really describes the effect of the suffering that is described in Isaiah the prophet in the 53rd chapter, where he is God's servant, and the servant of God undergoes suffering for the salvation of all. And so the image that is being poured out for the many is the image that is drawn from Isaiah. And then we're told, and for the forgiveness of sins. Now, this phrase is unique to Matthew in all four of the Passion stories. Mark, Luke, and John do not say that the pouring out of the cup is for the forgiveness of sins, the pouring out of the covenant. And again, the effect of the Eucharist and the effect of the action of Jesus is the forgiveness of sin. And again, it's not surprising that when the author is writing, when the community tells the story, they tell the story in the manner in which they experience the story week after week after week in the Eucharist. So he did at table what we do when we gather. Then Jesus says, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine again until I drink it anew in the kingdom, which expresses that the fulfillment of what is happening here is only going to happen yet to come in the kingdom of God. That what they are doing here is to be fulfilled in the kingdom of God. And then we're told they sang hymns as they left. Well, the Passover meal traditionally ends with the singing of Psalm 113, 114, 115, 116, 117, 118. And those are long psalms. And so the image is not that they get up and they stand around the table and they sing for a half hour or 40 minutes. The image is that they leave the upper room and they move toward Gethsemane, and as they're moving, they sing. Now, these are called the Hillel Psalms. And what they do is the Psalms proclaim the power of God to redeem. And they proclaim the faithfulness of God to Israel. So as the Passover ends, God is once again blessed as the Redeemer of the people and the Savior of the people. Again, an image that the church would see in Jesus. That Jesus is the power of God to redeem. That in his dying and rising, the redemption of the world will take place. Now, for the Jew, the celebration of the event triggers the actuality of the event. So by that I mean, they sit around the table, they celebrate the freedom they have won by God's grace from Egypt. In many Jewish homes, people would tell the story of freedom in their own lives. And what they believe is that when they tell the story and when they eat the meal, once again the freedom-producing grace of God is present among them. So it's not unlike what we believe, that in the prayer of the Eucharist, in the sharing of the body and blood of Christ, what happens is that the real presence of God's saving love is once again made present among us. That this is not just a commemoration, that in the eating and the drinking, as well as in the meal and the singing, that the action of God saving this people occurs again. Because the people needs a saving on and on and on and on. Because there's always an imprisonment that is going to grab toward a person. Or there's always a slavery that is imminent. And this loving, merciful God is always in the act of forgiving. So they leave the city and they go out the gate. They go out into beyond the city. St. John says they cross the Kedron Valley. So today, if you were there, you would go out the city gate, and then you'd have to cross a huge multi-lane freeway. And on the other side of the freeway is the Kedron Valley. And then it is a steep valley. You'd have to go down the valley and across the base of the valley and then up. And then you'd continue up the hill to the Mount of Olives. And it's a fairly steep hill. It's not unlike climbing up the Ohio Hill. You know, it's a good walk. And it would probably take maybe a couple of hours to do that, from when you leave the upper room and when you get to the Mount of Olives. So this high crest east of Jerusalem, called the Mount of Olives, is a fairly decent place for the growing of olives in a agriculturally very poor area around Jerusalem. You know, you can grow scrub bushes and not much more. Now, at a pilgrimage feast like the Passover, remember, people have come from all over to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. The Mount of Olives may very well have served as a campsite for large crowds unable to find lodging in the city. It could very well have been. And so the image is not the image of Jesus and these 12 finding this secluded place, but that there are just lots of people around. This is a campground. Jesus normally would not spend the night there. He would spend the night at Bethany. That's where he lodged. But this evening he goes up the Mount of Olives after the Last Supper, and he goes to the place called Gethsemane. The Mount of Olives is not the same as Gethsemane. Gethsemane is a grove within the Mount of Olives. So the Mount of Olives is the bigger place. Gethsemane is the smaller place. Jesus says to his disciples that I will go before you into Galilee. He tells them in verse 32 that he will return to them. He promises to return to the place where it all began. It begins in Galilee. That's where he calls his disciples. And he says, when this is all over, I'll return to Galilee. You'll find me in Galilee. And that's what the angel says to the people at the tomb on the day of Easter, is don't hang around here. He's gone into Galilee as he told you. You will find him there. Then we're told in the 34th verse that before the cock crows, Peter will deny the Lord. Now, the time of cock crow is very early in the morning. I mean, it's when the rooster crows. And it's probably around 3 a.m. So Jesus says, by the time the rooster crows, you will have denied me 3 times. Now we've got a thing back and forth. One of the texts says that the rooster will crow 3 times and then he will be denied. Others one said, the rooster will crow and you'll deny me 3 times. So the threes can go back and forth. But the point is that the rooster's crowing is to be the indication of this is the time that Peter has denied Jesus. The story of Jesus' last Passover would have been especially meaningful to Matthew's community. Jewish Christians in that community were very sensitive to the themes of Passover, for they probably would have continued to be celebrating the Passover. Remember that first generation church, and maybe even the second and third generation, was kind of a hybrid between Judaism and Christianity. They took things from their faith in Judaism, and they took some new things that Jesus had taught, and they make this hybrid thing. And that would have been important for the Jews who had become Christian in Matthew's gospel, because Matthew was trying to help the Jews and the Gentile Christians come to realize that they don't have to be at odds with each other. They don't have to compete with each other. That Jesus himself was an amalgam of the life of Israel and the new life that he proclaims. And that the life of Israel is good and strong, and what Jesus teaches is good and strong, and they are to be balanced with each other. So it's very possible that in the year 50, 60, 70, 80 AD, that Christians were celebrating Passover. That they would have that meal as part of their religious tradition. Okay, let's take a break, shall we?